And we need to talk about tonight what is really a rather delicate and painful subject. What I will speak about directly is euthanasia and assisted suicide. Angela Campbell later will speak more about the care of the elderly and the ethical dilemmas that arise in that field at the present time. Well, I'd like to begin with a couple of stories. One I got from a book, and the other from personal experience. The one from the book, the story was, it's true story, during a war, and bombs were falling, and a bomb fell and shrapnel flew, and some of the shrapnel went into the stomach, more or less, anyway, the intestines of a small girl, about 7 or 8. And there were 2 soldiers there. One of the soldiers was a doctor, as a matter of fact. And the girl began to scream horribly, and I don't know the correct medical terminology, but what was inside started to come out. And she was screaming and in pain. And one of the soldiers reached for his pistol, to shoot her, to put her out of her agony. And the doctor with him just said, no, there's no need, because she died at that very moment. So he didn't shoot the child. But we would have understood if he had. And yet, the question remains whether it would have been the right thing to do, though very understandable. And I imagine, I may be wrong, but if I'd done that myself, every time I remembered that, I would have to justify to myself what I had done, because the instinct in us, both to live and to preserve the life of others, is so strong, and the taking of a life, even in such circumstances, would go against something very deep within us. So we would have to say that had he shot that girl, it would not have been objectively the right thing to do. And nature did take its course very quickly. St. Augustine says this: it is never licit to kill another, even if he or she should wish it, indeed request it, because hanging between life and death, he or she begs for help, nor is it licit even when a sick person is no longer able to live. Well, that's one story. I mean, just to show how agonizing these things can be, and yet we're not entirely bereft of clarity. Now, the other story, which I can never think about without a good deal of pain, there was a woman somewhat younger than me, not hugely so, but somewhat younger than me. She was an atheist. She was single. She was a very good person, good living person. She worked caring for elderly people. And she used to come to the monastery. That's how I and other members of the community got to know her. She used to visit us. It's strange, I mean, she said she was an atheist, she didn't believe in God, but she used to love to come to the monastery. She'd come sit at the back of the church, and so on. Now, she was diagnosed with cancer. I don't know what kind. And she then came across the information about the place in Zurich, Dignitas, where you can go and commit suicide with assisted. And she thought this was, she said when she discovered that, she was so delighted to hear that that could be done. Now, you can imagine, and she mentioned this to several of us, and you can imagine we took another view. And she didn't, I'm not sure I fully understood her motives, but it wasn't the avoidance of pain. It wasn't that she was frightened of the pain that was coming her way. She had a very low opinion of herself, or indeed perhaps even of human life generally. She would say, I am worth the same as a tree, no more, no less. There's really no essential difference between me and a tree. And I think her motive was that not to be a burden to other people. Now, it was put to her that she would be cared for. There were people. She had friends. She knew a lot of people. We knew her well in the community. She was a very likable person, and we were willing, and other people were willing to care for her. Now, she was very touched to hear that, but she said no. And she went and did this. It was awful. It was a terrible thing to think, because we knew when she was going, we knew at what time this was happening. She'd asked that her ashes be sent back to the monastery. And sure enough, 2 weeks or so after she had done this, a box came with Swiss stamps on, and all perfectly packaged. It was awful, absolutely awful. And reflecting on that experience, what struck me as really awful was that she refused the care, affection, love, whatnot, practical care that other people were truly willing to give her. It was as though it was just an individual act, in a way, separating herself from the human community, from society. That's to my mind, you could say, well, it's hubris or something like that. I don't know, and I don't judge her. But reflecting on the experience, thinking of the people who would have wished to care for her, they would have wanted to do that, and she said no. But anyway, those are just two experiences that I've had. But if you think of those, immediately a cluster of values emerges really in this whole domain. I mean, respect for human life, respect for the processes of nature, human solidarity, awareness of our limits. And behind these kind of episodes, I think we do hear the echo of the old and new, ever valid commandment, thou shalt not kill. Even in these difficult circumstances, it isn't right to take someone else's life or one's own. However, even in those circumstances, to do that offends something very essential in our humanity, I think. Now, euthanasia literally means a happy death or an easy death. Now, there's a certain amount of discussion as to how to define it, which is rather important, because if you're going to assess it morally, then you need to define it clearly, and what constitutes euthanasia and what doesn't. But this is a definition given by John Paul II in his encyclical Evangelium Vitae. And as usual, I'm dependent on him to quite a large extent. Euthanasia, in the strict sense, is understood to be an action or omission which of itself and by intention causes death, with the purpose of eliminating all suffering. That distinguishes it from what we might call ordinary murder. I may do something or omit to do something which of itself and by intention causes death, but it might not be with the purpose of eliminating all suffering. It may simply with the purpose of eliminating my suffering by getting rid of the other person. Assisted suicide is taking one's own life with the help of another. In euthanasia, someone else ends my life. In assisted suicide, I do, but with the help of someone else. Now, euthanasia may be voluntary, that is to say with the patient's consent, or involuntary, of course. That's sort of an obvious distinction without it. It may be active, that is brought about by doing something that brings about the death of a person, for example, a lethal injection, or passive, by withdrawing or withholding treatment that would keep someone alive. Now, both euthanasia and assisted suicide are illegal in most countries, and in this country too. And attempts to introduce euthanasia and assisted suicide to make them legal here were rejected by the House of Lords in 2006 and 2009, and in the Scottish Parliament in 2010. But the push for it continues, and in May, Lord Falconer is going to introduce a bill in favour of assisted suicide in the House of Lords, and Margot MacDonald plans to do something similar in the Scottish Parliament. Now, active voluntary euthanasia is legal in Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. And assisted suicide is legal in Switzerland and in the states, in the United States of Oregon, Washington, and Montana. Now, why is there a push towards this? And this is quite complex. I mean, you know, it's something we can discuss later, because I think there are several factors that seem to lead people in this way. Of course, in many ways, it is the advances of medicine that have created the present dilemma, because people live longer in the Western world anyway, and their lives can be prolonged in a way that was not possible once. And yet quality of life, as in that phrase, may diminish. And this is particularly the case when people suffer from dementia. And there's also the physical and emotional toll that falls on carers in such circumstances, especially in family situations. There was quite a good article in the Light of the North, a recent edition of that, the Diocesan magazine, by a lady whom, well, I encouraged her to put it in, actually. Her mother suffers from dementia and is in a care home, but she goes and visits her and takes her out regularly. And one of her children has a very complicated medical condition as well. And it's a very sensitive discussion by her of what this has meant for her life and how she has adapted to that or interpreted it. And there's also, of course, the less worthy consideration that our society is becoming top-heavy, economically burdened by the demands of care of the elderly, and probably it's not going to get less. So that's, I think, I'm sure many of you are able to fill this out. But there's also the view which John Paul II mentions, that when the prevailing tendency is to value life only to the extent that it brings pleasure and well-being, suffering seems like an unbearable setback, something from which one must be freed at all costs. Yes, so much depends upon your conception of life and of a good life. And if you look at the picture of a good life that is conveyed through the media, through television, through advertising, it is, if you're a man, being handsome, if you're a lady, being beautiful. It means having good teeth, for example, because they're very important in the photograph. It means having a car, which is good. It means never having more than 2 children, really. All these elements go up to make the good life, or simply life itself. And now, death is considered senseless, meaningless, if it suddenly interrupts a life still open to a future of new and interesting experiences. This is John Paul II. But it becomes a rightful liberation once life is held to be no longer meaningful because it is filled with pain and inexorably doomed to even greater suffering. In many ways, in our Western society, and we've touched on this before in other seminars, I think it's a key point, that we suffer from, to use long words, reductionist anthropologies. We suffer from a diminished understanding of what it means to be a human being and of what makes a good life. And therefore, if those essential ingredients are not there, then life is not worth living. There is no big horizon against which suffering can be seen and endured. So if life is defined as quality of life, and quality of life is understood in those terms, then why needlessly prolong life when it could be quietly, gently ended? There is also the whole liberal individualism thing. To quote John Paul II again, furthermore, when he denies or neglects his fundamental relationship to God, man thinks he is his own rule and measure, with the right to demand that society should guarantee him the ways and means of deciding what to do with his life in full and complete autonomy. In other words, there is a right to die, or a right to choose my own form and time of death. This is simply a rightful expression of my personal autonomy. I did it my way. Now, I was very struck looking up these things on the internet, reading a piece about the practice of euthanasia by the Nazis. And there was a little thing about this, and said, oh yeah, this is very wrong, of course. What was wrong about it, it was said, was that it was the state that decided who should live or who should not. That was what was said to be wrong. It was fine if you did it, or you did it to auntie or granny. That was fine. But if the state suddenly said, people with 3 heads shouldn't be allowed to exist, okay, that was wrong because the state said it. But that's not the real reason why it's wrong. It was a most revealing statement, position. Now, there is also a particularly hideous understanding of human dignity and personhood around. And it's abominable, but it does exist. Namely, that human dignity, or being a person, consists in actually being able to exercise our capacities for reasoning and self-determination, decision-making. So if those are impaired, you are no longer a person, and therefore do not have the rights a person has. That a philosophy which, as someone said, in any other age would have been thought utterly unacceptable and abominable, is knocking around, is being pushed by certain theorists, certain philosophers at the moment. Or again, personhood is defined in terms of productivity and efficiency. I think Father Stewart mentioned that at the last seminar. As long as I can work and produce, and be creative and productive, and contribute to the gross national GNP or whatever, my life is worthwhile. But the moment I'm just a drag on the economy, then no good. I enter, in fact, some subhuman category. There are people who even say that. You're no longer a person. If you can't make a decision of your own, you're no longer a person. If you can't make money, you can't play the piano or whatever, you're no longer a person. Now, in this context, says John Paul II, the temptation grows to have recourse to euthanasia, that is, to take control of death and bring it about before its time, gently ending one's own life or the life of others. In reality, what might seem logical and humane, when looked at more closely, is seen to be senseless and inhuman. Now, I'm not a medic, and I'm not a bioethicist. I'm just a poor bishop, so I simply offer you here the teaching of the Church on this particular point. Okay. Now, on the basis of the 5th commandment, the Church opposes both euthanasia and suicide, and has always done so. Now, just to indicate that in some of the more modern teachings of the Church, Vatican II, Gaudium et Spes, number 27, puts together any type of murder, genocide, abortion, euthanasia, or willful self-destruction as shameful acts. They poison human civilization, do more damage to the perpetrators than the victims, and dishonour the Creator. Now, in 1980, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith did a declaration on euthanasia, and it said this: "It is necessary to state firmly once more that nothing and no one can in any way permit the killing of an innocent human being, whether a fetus or an embryo, an infant or an adult, an old person or one suffering from incurable disease, or a person who is dying. Furthermore, no one is permitted to ask for this act of killing, either for himself or herself, or for another person entrusted to his or her care, nor can he or she consent to it, either explicitly or implicitly, nor can any authority legitimately recommend or permit such an action. For it is a question of the violation of the divine law, an offence against the dignity of the human person, a crime against life, and an attack on humanity." Now that's quite strong stuff. According to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, euthanasia is morally unacceptable and must always be forbidden and excluded. The encyclical Evangelium Vitae of John Paul II, where he treats of euthanasia at some length, and there, among other things, he says, now that this is the kind of language popes use on these occasions, that's got a sort of theological density to it, but in harmony with the teaching of my predecessors and in communion with the bishops of the Catholic Church, I confirm that euthanasia is a grave violation of the law of God, since it is the deliberate and morally unacceptable killing of a human person. This doctrine is based upon the natural law and upon the written word of God, is transmitted by the Church's tradition and taught by the ordinary and universal magisterium. Theologically, that's quite, he's making a very strong statement there, that there isn't really room for doubt on this. Now, on a related matter, this has been a very sensitive one. This is concerning the provision of nutrition and hydration to people in a permanent vegetative state, PVS. There's an important talk that John Paul II gave in 2004, in which he said that refusal to provide basic nourishment to the unresponsive can amount to euthanasia, and that to provide nutrition and hydration by artificial means is not medical treatment, but ordinary care of people. Ordinary care. Assuming it is doable, assuming you're in a culture where it's doable, which we are in the West. Now that's a very distilled presentation of the teaching, sort of focused specifically on this whole question of euthanasia and by implication assisted suicide. But so I just want to flesh it out and then conclude there. But a first observation, this is something very important in all these matters. If the Church says no to the above actions, it's not for the sake of being contrary, or not because she's old-fashioned, or not because she wants to impose her own worldview on everyone else, whether they like it or not. It's because such actions contravene the true good of the human being and humanity as a whole, and certain basic human values. So underneath the no is a yes. That's the thing. There's a yes to God's will for humanity, which is that we live, a yes to human dignity properly understood, a yes to the vulnerable, a yes to life, a yes to human solidarity, and to the true vocation of those in the middle. There's always the matter of the underlying vision of the human being. And there are so many different anthropologies floating around, and these determine how people approach these issues. Now, one Catholic writer on this matter mentions some of the ones that are knocking around. The person as functional system, ghost, rat, computer, human being is a computer, machine, sentience, in other words, a feeling being, self-consciousness, that's what humanity is, language user, chooser. Those are some of the views that float around. Christianity holds to a realist account of the person as a being that is material, living, animal, rational, free, social, emotional, and immortal. That's quite a good combination. And again, as I said before, we are blessed. We've got this wonderful, rich, broad, realistic, and yet hopeful vision of the human being. It's the best one on the market. It's as simple as that. It really is. And therefore, sorry to finish off this chap's sentence, and so Christianity offers metaphysical and biological arguments for this personhood from the first moment of that being's existence to his or her last. Now, while insisting, this is a very important point, that euthanasia is prohibited by the Fifth Commandment, at the same time the Church affirms that there is no obligation to prolong life by every possible means. Life, in the sense of physical existence, is the basic human good, but it's not the supreme one. We can lay down our lives for our friends in certain circumstances, or for what we believe. And there is the moment, there is surely a right moment, when we must simply open our arms to what St. Francis calls Sister Death, when she comes to take us. There is a right moment. There's no need to go on fighting. I knew one monk who, as he was dying, said, I didn't realize dying was so ordinary. Interesting. You know, there's a lot of hype about it. I didn't know dying was so ordinary. There is room for freedom here. Perhaps it's a bit like to think of recent events, how John Paul II faced the last years of his papacy. He sort of died, went through this great experience of public suffering, as it were, and this Pope who just quietly withdraws into the shadow. There are two different ways of approaching those things. That's an analogy. But to quote John Paul II, euthanasia must be distinguished from the decision to forego so-called aggressive medical treatment. In other words, medical procedures which no longer correspond to the real situation of the patient, either because they are by now disproportionate to any expected results, or because they impose an excessive burden on the patient and his family. In such situations, when death is clearly imminent and inevitable, one can in conscience refuse forms of treatment that would only secure a precarious and burdensome prolongation of life, so long as the normal care due to the sick person in similar cases is not interrupted. So they should continue to have nourishment and hydration as long as they can assimilate it. Certainly there is a moral obligation to care for oneself and to allow oneself to be cared for, but this duty must take account of concrete circumstances. It needs to be determined whether the means of treatment available are objectively proportionate to the prospects for improvement. To forego extraordinary or disproportionate means is not the equivalent of suicide or euthanasia. It rather expresses acceptance of the human condition in the face of death. Now it's the line between these two that is the delicate one, the thing that requires discernment and prudence. The Church also teaches that it is legitimate to make use of painkillers or sedatives, even when this may result in diminished consciousness or a shortening of life, if no other means exist, and if in the given circumstances this does not prevent the carrying out of other religious and moral duties. Now, okay, I think to end, one can broaden the picture a little bit. And I think what Christianity calls us to, really, what the Church advocates, and it's verified in the hospice movement and, please God, in Catholic hospitals and care homes, is really a rediscovery of a culture of dying, or a kind of what they used to call an ars moriendi, the art of dying. The ancients were very clear on this. If you read the stories of the saints and ancient monks and so on, I mean, they were superb when it came to dying. They sort of got it down to a fine art, one might say, and they did it surrounded by their community and so on, and supported by prayer, and they knew when it was going to happen, and they sought reconciliation with the people who they had offended, and so on. And our culture finds the whole thing of death very hard, very difficult, can't look it in the face. But may I be alive when I die, was the prayer of one doctor. May I be alive when I die. Now, a dying person should be provided with every reasonable help that medicine can give, be surrounded by love and tenderness and compassion, should be helped to satisfy their moral and family duties, and above all, able to prepare in a fully conscious way, health permitting, for their definitive meeting with God. In other words, their physical, emotional, social, and religious needs should be met, as should those of the family and those caring for them. We're talking, therefore, about something holistic that recognizes the human being in his or her fullness, body and spirit, an earthling and immortal. This good sentence, this is the first sentence in the passage in the Catechism of the Catholic Church on euthanasia. Those whose lives are diminished or weakened deserve special respect. And this is surely especially true of the elderly and the terminally ill. They deserve special respect. And we are Christians, we want to be inspired by the truth and love of Christ. We want to share his passion and compassion for the poor, the hungry, the sick, the most vulnerable. Now here is I think this is a wonderful passage from Anthony Fisher, a Dominican who writes on these matters. This is about the difference, or why early Christianity took off so successfully and transformed the culture to which it belonged, which it entered. Social historian Rodney Stark has suggested that the catalyst for the spectacular takeoff of Christianity in the Greco-Roman world, the world of antiquity around the Mediterranean basin, was this special concern it showed the poor and needy. With surprising speed, Christianity overturned popular morality and social expectations all around the Mediterranean world, challenging and converting cultures as well as individuals. See how these Christians love each other, people said in astonishment. The early Christians were notorious for their respect for every human person. They refused to engage in the commonplace practices of abortion, infanticide, suicide, or euthanasia, even in hard cases. They looked after the poor, starving, widowed, crippled, sick, elderly, and dying, even in difficult situations. They stayed around to care, even when there was a plague. Their simple, egalitarian approach had a tremendous kerygmatic effect. That means the effect of a proclamation of the gospel. No longer did racial, ethnic, cultural citizenship, social or gender differences mark the boundaries of moral concern and obligation. Now people of every class and background were to be loved and protected for themselves. The distribution of food and other alms to the poor preached as powerfully as the Apostles' words a subversive inclusiveness of the nobodies in this new kingdom of God. So perhaps now, who are the nobodies? We always have to ask that, because that's a sort of shifting sands there. Who are the nobodies in our society? Is it the elderly and the dying? Perhaps, I don't know. But there it is. In due course, the Christian virtue of hospitality meant the erection of the first hospices, poorhouses, soup kitchens, and feeding stations in local churches and monasteries. Later, it motivated great social institutions such as hospitals, orphanages, chivalric orders of hospitallers, St. Vincent de Paul conferences, Caritas, and the rest. Yes, it is Christianity that invented hospitals. That's a forgotten little fact, just as it's Christianity that invented universities as well. But there's a vision of how the Christian understanding of the human being transformed a culture. So we feel so much on the defensive. We seem to be defending old values which are being eroded by the exciting new ones. It's interesting that in the ancient world, Roman world, Christianity was rejected by the intelligentsia because it was something new. It was a completely different attitude. If it was a new thing, it must be wrong. That was the general cultural assumption. If it just appeared in Palestine 60 years ago, then, it's not worth bothering with. It's rather the opposite of our mentality. And now Christianity, the intelligentsia rejects Christianity because it's old. So it's an interesting reversal, so we can never get it right. But in fact, it is a force for novelty. So there we are. Thank you. Good.